We're going to be addressing the general question of how can history teaching adapt and respond to the latest developments in environmental thinking. I'm delighted to welcome the panelists today. They are Catherine Byrne, who leads the PGC History programme and teaches within the MSc in Learning and Teaching here at the University of Oxford, is also the chair of the Secondary Committee of the Historical Association and co-editor of the professional journal Teaching History. The most recent issue of which was co-edited with one of our other panelists, Alison Kitson, focused on the teaching of history of climate and the environment. We're also joined by David Hibbert, who's the head of humanities and acting assistant head for teaching and learning at the Charwell School. David is particularly interested in environmental issues in relation to curriculum design at Key Stage 3. Tom Hilton, also from the Charwell School, joins us. He's history teacher and deputy head, and is interested in the whole school policy and leadership implications of environmental issues. Alison Kitson comes from the University College London Centre for Climate Change and Sustainability Education. The principal aim of that centre is to help embed climate change and sustainability education across the whole school curriculum by providing a programme of free CPD for all teachers, tailored by subject and phase. Our final guest is Amanda Power, who is an associate professor in history at St Catherine's College here again at Oxford. And she's been involved in developing new approaches to historical study that speak to the concerns of the mounting climate and environmental crisis. Now, today's session is going to be a general discussion around the themes of history teaching and adapting to and responding to developments in environmental thinking. The discussion will be led by Catherine Byrne, will be very interactive and drawing on the expertise of our panelists today. We encourage you to submit questions or comments through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to do that. There will also be some interactive elements where the panel may be setting some questions for you to consider and to contribute to. So please don't be shy. And when it comes to that point, with these kinds of sessions really benefit from full interaction amongst our participants, and that's the purpose, to get you thinking about these really important issues. I just want to give a quick plug to the Oxford Education Deanery, which is an organisation set up within the Department of Education, designed to bring researchers and practitioners closer together in all the respects that we can do. We have a newsletter, and I know that our administrator, will be putting into the chat links and so on to take you to the website where you can sign up for our newsletter so that you can be informed of future events, not just around history, not just around sustainability, but reflecting all areas of scholarly inquiry and practice at the university. So please do join that mailing list. Have a browse of the website to see some of the events that we've got upcoming. I'll give you another reminder of that at the end of the hour. But it just leaves me to pass over to Catherine and the panel, and to thank you all again for coming along. I hope you have a wonderful session.
Thanks very much, Hamish, for that introduction to all of us and to the work of the Deanery. I feel really privileged to be able to ask questions of the sort of group of people assembled, because it represents that kind of connection between academic history and school history. So I'm going to kind of move sort of in that direction, starting by questions to Amanda, as an associate professor of history, is really sort of pioneering the work at an academic level, and then sort of move through to Alison, really at that kind of intersection between academic work, so based at UCL but really committed to teacher education, and then picking up with what's happening with Charwell as a kind of typical example. But I think a huge amount of this rests on the work of historians like Amanda. So kind of wanted to kick off the seminar by really turning to Amanda and just asking you to give us a sense of what is happening in relation to history of the environment at an academic level. What sorts of questions are historians asking? Let's start there with what are the questions that are being asked, and then we'll look at who's asking them and where and how many. But start by giving us a flavour of what's going on.
Sure. Hi everyone. So I thought it might be worth just starting by pointing out that in some senses environmental history isn't very new, and it might be familiar to everyone in a slightly different guise. in quite old questions about how landscapes were used and how agricultural practices developed, and the field of disease. People have been interested in the Black Death for a really long time, and the effect of
Oh, and we lose Amanda at a critical moment.
cultural agendas and economic agendas, but also not unrelated to that, huge advances in the science behind being able to understand past climates and past environments. So we now have access to very detailed information that you can get from ice cores or from peat core samples from bogs, that can tell you, and looking at tree trunks, I guess, is an older one, but you put all these things together and you can get a remarkably precise sense of microclimates in particular regions over long periods of time. And this is, of course, really exciting because it tells you a whole lot of things that we couldn't possibly have known before, that might be recorded in documents, but the document might say, oh, it was a bad winter, but we don't really know what that means. Now, to some extent, we can know what it means. But if we're thinking about questions for historians, these are obviously not techniques that historians are trained to use themselves. So we're sort of suddenly a bit dependent on disciplines that we have no training to talk to, really, and no habit of talking to. Archaeology can be a bit of a bridge discipline, but I think it might be too congratulatory to say that we habitually talk to archaeologists all the time, and climate scientists are sort of another step away. So I think a lot of the questions have revolved at an academic level, have revolved around how these intellectual relationships should work, and what the place is of history. And so probably most of you will have come across anxieties around environmental determinism, and I think that a lot of that springs from, if this looks like it's scientifically just a fact, what place is there for historians in these conversations? And so I think and there's been a lot of really good thinking about that in the last few years, even as historians have refined the approach and become a bit more assertive about the role of our discipline in nuancing these discussions and seeing what it really means to humans. So you can tell it gets colder, but what actually happens when it gets colder in different societies with different organizations and different landscapes and agricultural systems and so on. So I think that those are I don't know whether that's enough to kick off with.
It's a great start. I loved your comment about historians getting more assertive about the place for them. I mean, maybe I'll push that a little bit and just get you to say, well, what does sort of being more assertive kind of meant, really, and what are the questions, if you like. I mean, you've talked about the reality of climate change as one of the, as it gets cold, what does that mean to people? Can you give other examples of, whether it's the sort of questions you're asking or other people are asking, and what's happened as you've been more assertive? Have they given you space, or is it, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it's been working out what we actually have to offer as historians. And again, it wasn't immediately obvious when these conversations began in the most recent iterations. I mean, one kind of classic example, I guess, is the fall of the Roman Empire, which is a really old historical question. And then suddenly we're being told there is volcanic activity, and kind of circulating pathogens. And so there's all this kind of sciencey stuff about why the Roman Empire fell. And I think maybe then historians thought, okay, that's why the Roman Empire fell, really. And it wasn't to do with, barbarians or any of the old explanations. But I think that the more that we've thought about it, we've thought, well, just because one of these things has happened, a kind of societal response and the mechanisms for the societal response is actually what makes for the change. And so I think building these things in together, and I think coming to scientists as well and saying, yes, that's useful, but what you really need to know is what happened. And of course, the scientists see this themselves. They want us to be in these conversations. It's not like there's any intentional exclusion. They often are looking for specialists in history who don't exist to join the conversations. So it is a question of training people. But I think also in kind of wider international conversations, which I think is probably important for justifying this in the classroom, there's the sort of shifting emphasis to mitigation and adaptation as strategies for dealing with climate change really require a lot of understanding of present societies and how they might respond to things. But you can do that with past societies, and it's actually very much more helpful if you can track things over long periods of time and ask quite important questions like, do egalitarian communities prosper better? What sorts of resources and what sorts of distribution of resources, what sorts of value systems can help a society be more resilient? So I think these conversations can come backwards and forwards in and out of policy and just into pure study of the past in ways that are quite exciting.
I'll move on to how that might connect with school in a moment, but just to get a sense of, if you like, the scale on which it's happening at university, or the extent to which students are, picking up on it and excited by, or perhaps alarmed by, interdisciplinary work. I mean, I'm quite intrigued because we've had a curriculum at school that has been very strongly subject focused and in quite clear sort of silos almost. So how undergraduates are reacting or picking up on the scope, or perhaps the expectation that they should, talk to scientists or archaeologists or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of them find it very exciting, and it feels new, and it feels a bit daunting. I mean, I tend to say just read the abstracts and see what you can do with it in terms of an extra point for an essay, which is not where I hope we would end up, but it's a good place to start. But I think even just broadening out the questions, they've become very familiar with the fairly top-down sort of way that a lot of the analysis happens. I mean, at university, as much as in the school curriculum, the king decided to do this, so therefore, it happened. But if you think about, what were the resources, what did the, how did you provision the army? How did all these things actually work in practice? And you just kind of widen the net. So this moves a little bit away from climate, but it brings in environment as resource-based, so that you sort of, the questions become a little bit more kind of sprawling and often exciting if you can do it without frightening the horses too much. So you start looking at costs and environmental consequences of particular forms of rule. How much are they cutting down the forests completely in order to build ships? It's a sort of old question about the Spanish Armada, but you can do it all over the place. And what happens if you have degraded the environment? What happens next? And you don't need to have a whole heap of expertise to ask these questions, but you just need to think of asking them. And a strategy that could be useful for everyone here is just asking the question, even if you don't know the answer. It already makes it a bit more interesting.
Yeah. I think that's what kind of wonderful encouragement. Actually, the questions are the kind of place to start. And I will say at this point, I've failed to say it when I picked up from Hamish. I'm posing questions and following my interests. If you'd like to add your own questions in, please do, put them in the chat, and we'll kind of intersperse those. I'm going to move to Alison in this sort of brilliant intermediary position. And obviously UCL has made a strong commitment by having a centre, committed to climate change and sustainability education. And Alison made a brave step within that, saying, as we develop resources, history should be part of that conversation, and should, I want to start there and begin with, modules in history to kind of, make that assertive place that Amanda was talking about. So if we're moving to thinking about what is happening in academic history, and to some extent in popular history, and how that is connecting with school, can you sort of tell us a bit about where you've chosen to start, and why those starting points, and the sorts of things you have begun to try and help school teachers to pursue?
Sure, thanks Catherine, and thanks Amanda for that really brilliant summary. It was a little bit of self-interest and bias that we started with history in the centre, I should say, because obviously I'm a historian and used to be a head of history in Oxford, in fact. So it's great to see so many people here, and actually the people attending sessions like this, you are the people at the forefront of thinking about this in the classroom. And I will respond to Catherine's question in just a moment, but just to say that I think it is quite daunting for history teachers who are already juggling a lot, and may have been doing all kinds of marvellous things to decolonise your curriculum recently, and with all the usual pressures of a school and so on. And here I am saying, do lots more environmental history in schools. So I understand the pressures, and you're not alone in thinking that, but I'm assuming by attending this that you do have an interest in how to do it. So and there isn't an easy answer, I should say, either, but we're all exploring possibilities. And what we've done in the centre, I've been working on the history work with Michael Riley, who many of you will know, used to be director of the school's history project. And we, as a starting point, we have some online modules. I'll make sure you have a link in the chat to access them. In our introductory module, Michael and I were thinking, what are the useful starting points for teachers? And we've drawn quite explicitly on a number of key what we see as key works, not all written by historians, and that's quite interesting in itself. But we look at 3 writers in particular. So Peter Frankopan and his Earth Transformed book, and there's an interview with Peter in the module. Alice Bell's work on the history of the climate crisis, which is really different to Peter's book. Peter's book is huge. In fact, it's a kind of whole of planetary time. And Alice Bell's work just kicks off in 1850 and looks at the history of climate, human anthropogenic climate change, really. And then we also look at the work of Amitav Ghosh, who is not a historian, he's a writer, and he wrote a marvelous book called The Nutmeg's Curse, looking at the impact of colonialism on the environment, and how that links with modern geopolitics. So they're 3 quite different books, but we see the power, we call that section the power of storytelling. And so we use that as a way partly to demonstrate what Amanda's already said, which is environmental history. It's not new, but it is becoming certainly of real public interest. And it's been interesting, I think, how much public interest there's been in Peter Frankopan's book. And it's had, you know, incredibly good reviews. And I think that in itself is going to stimulate more public interest. So that's one of the starting points in our first module. What are people writing about now? And what are the implications of that for the classroom? I'll stop there because you might have other questions, Catherine.
Oh, might go on. Maybe I'll sort of jump to actually the school. So talk to Tom and David, and they can. I don't know how they're going to fight out who takes the questions first, but it would be really interesting to hear your starting points. And so you know, Alison's talked about coming from, and it's really interesting, 3 different types of scholarship, whether that's where you started, whether it's perhaps been triggered by the young people themselves, because it is such a key issue. So tell us a bit about, you know, and I know in coming into this you said we're at the beginnings of it, but it's really interesting to hear what those beginnings are and how you've moved into the space.
Great, thanks, Catherine. Yeah, perhaps I should start there then, because hearing what everyone said so far, our starting points seem really similar. That actually it probably didn't come from history, if we're honest. It comes from exactly what you're pointing out. The student interest is huge, and the motivation is huge. The existing knowledge, the body of knowledge, is actually really significant as well, but not necessarily about history. So I think we'd be lying to say we have come at it from a history angle. We've got big bodies of interested scientists. We've got ecologists growing within the school, absolutely. But we're also thinking very much now of, okay, put crudely, how do we attract the students who aren't naturally leaning towards STEM as they go higher up the school? We really want the arts and humanities students to be involved as well, because they care about it, but their skill set and their A-level studies, it gets narrowed, does tend to lead them away from it. So those would probably be our initial points. I mean, David may have some different stuff about where history's starting point is and where he is with that.
Yeah, I suppose coming at it specifically, I'm in an interesting position as a head of humanities, and at Charwell, humanities is history and geography. So there's a real kind of intersection there. And I think just going back to some of the questions that have already been raised, that a little bit of wrestling about the purpose of the subject and whether the subject is addressing the interests and needs of the students as it should. That question that sometimes students that pick geography and not history for GCSE ask, which is, well, what is history going to do for me? Geography is the subject that's going to help me understand this fundamental issue. It kind of provokes, I think, rightly, some real wrestling. And I think some of our starting points did come from some of those same texts that you mentioned. I'm just thinking about conversations I've had with my brilliant Key Stage 3 curriculum lead. We went to see Peter Frankopan talk at the Oxford Literary Festival coming out of the Earth Transformed. We've been talking about it and the implications of that for our curriculum ever since and before. And it's really been a process of sort of professional wrestling of what does this look like? What does this mean? Quite a lot of abortive, oh, we could do this, maybe not. Or we could do this, maybe not. There are some things that we've done which I think are really exciting, but very much a kind of ongoing process of wrestling with the subject, with what we're trying to accomplish and what the right way of trying to do it is, basically.
I'd be really mean and kind of push you to tell us about one abortive avenue. So I think it's really good to hear about, and may give people confidence to kind of start off by saying, tell us something you tried and why it didn't work, and then tell us about one of your triumphs. I think it'd be really good, or something you're continuing to pursue.
Yeah, so initially after hearing Frankopan talk and engaging with the book, we were actually at the same time planning a new end to our Year 9 curriculum, which was based on a James Baldwin quote. And we wanted to do some post-1945 history, and we wanted to do something that's really kind of foregrounded history with explanatory power, real kind of tangible explanatory power in the present. So we came up with this sort of broad overarching question of how far, or how is history literally present in all that we do? And then within that, they have various different case studies. We did the Cold War, Northern Ireland, and the Middle East. And the initial plan was that the fourth component of that unit would be an environmental history unit. And we started to think about it, and then we started to realize that it would be a mini unit, and trying to do something big history in 5 or 6 lessons just seemed wrong. It didn't seem to cohere with the history around it, and it seemed like it was sort of siloing it in a way that didn't seem to make sense to us. So after really beginning to plan that quite seriously, we abandoned that as an approach, and partly inspired by some of the discourse around the teaching of the British Empire and avoiding siloing that in individual units and thinking about seeding it throughout the curriculum. We've started to look for opportunities where we can do that. And that's probably, I think, not that easy. I think partly that's due to the substantive knowledge which has often been privileged within history curriculums in the past, and certainly still is in ours. Often social, political, military history doesn't always lend itself easily to the integration of environmental issues and themes. But I think where we have been able to find the right moment in the curriculum, it can be really powerful. So probably my favorite example of this is a lesson from that Middle East unit near the end of Year 9. And it's a lesson on the impact of oil on the Middle East. So the way that we frame that is it's a lesson that is based around, yes, we do start with the big picture. We do start with the Industrial Revolution and then the impact of coal and then oil. And we use a little extract from Frankopan's book to kind of talk about oil in the big story, and then get into the really tangible consequences for the Middle East itself. We talk about Saudi Arabia, and we talk about Iran, and we talk about the transformative impact on the economics, religious and social implications of the discovery of oil in those countries. And I think that's a really nice example, because it's sort of it jives so well with the political, economic and social themes of the unit, while also kind of making the environmental angle really meaningful in curricular terms. So that's something that we found really works. But I think you have to get it right, and you have to pick the right moments if you're going to do that. And exactly where those are, I think particularly earlier on in our curriculum in Year 7 and 8, we're still wrestling with. But yeah, that's what we've been thinking about.
Right. It feels both exciting and really daunting. And I just wanted to ask a bit about kind of teacher subject knowledge or teacher confidence. How you mentioned the Middle East, and most people go, I wouldn't touch it with a barge pole. So how have you negotiated that or supported teachers in negotiating that? And have parents been supportive, concerned, not noticed?
In terms of dealing with controversial...
Well, let's start with the teacher confidence. How have teachers built their knowledge, or made it possible to experiment, or felt as they've taken it on, I guess. Yeah,
I mean, I think that's definitely an issue in relation to the climate side of things. I mean, that I mentioned my Key Stage 3 lead earlier. She's very much a polymath, did science A levels, feels quite confident with some of that, and I think that makes the conversations much easier to have, really. I'm much less so I find it quite daunting. And in relation to something like the Middle East, I think there is an element of making sure that really good quality resources are in people's hands and having conversations about them. So I took the lead on the Middle East unit and the oil unit, coming out the back of reading Frankopan and other works of scholarship on the Middle East. And I think there is an element of getting good quality materials in people's hands really helps, but not in a kind of controlling, not in a kind of you must use this way, but in a sort of this is there as a scaffold and a support, and it comes with conversations and collaboration about, wait, can you just ask about this? If a student asks a question like this, how do I respond? Those kind of really meaningful collaborations with trusted colleagues. I think that kind of combination of kind of realizing that time poor, worried teachers sometimes need resourcing, but then also not over controlling in a way that allows people agency and allows people to translate it in their own rooms, in their own heads, in the ways that they need to.
I think there's also a sense of time scale. I think that David's been really thoughtful about, and interesting hearing the questions that are raised now, that asking questions and allowing people time to think and digest, as opposed to, right, we have to put this unit in now. Someone's got to plan it this summer to deliver it for year 8. And David's always so thoughtful about moving and directing that pace. I think as a senior leader, I'd be really concerned, and again, to kind of people listening, is asking the right questions of your SLT to ensure that that pace is right. If you've got to build a huge amount of knowledge before you do something really good, then accept that that's what you're going to do first, and that's the strategy. And I mean, David's been so thoughtful about the way he's led that has made all the difference on the ground with the team of teachers he leads who are going to teach anything we kind of collectively plan, I suppose.
Now in 2 directions to go. I think I'll pursue the interdisciplinary, then I'll come back to the resources and go back to Alison and stuff. So I mean, David, you mentioned being a head of humanities, and Tom, you've obviously got that whole school oversight. I mean, are things changing in the sense that you are doing more interdisciplinary work, and is that proving possible to do?
Yeah, really good question. I think whenever I hear the words cross-curricular, I still sort of shudder a bit, because I've never been in a situation where I felt it's been done really in a really fulfilling, successful way. I guess there are things that we're seeing that help. I mean, it's partly down to the work of Kim, who's listening today, but making it really visual in the school seems to have really helped. And I think there's somewhere to go with that, with the history as well. So the fact that students are now mapping the biodiversity on the site, and that's within science lessons, it's within the clubs. Then when you're explaining a concept in a history lesson, it has a meaning that they can transfer really quite tangibly. That seems better to me than a kind of cross-curricular unit. I think there is some vehicle in the natural history GCSE, which we might come on to later as well, about how we might unite kind of disciplines there, because we have some scientists working on that. But the bit they're terrified about is the history bit and the potential understanding of the social impact of all the change. So I think they will want some help with that. And I think doing it at teacher level first, around potentially planning some of that curriculum, could also influence what we're doing in, say, Key Stage 3 history. So it's definitely still a challenge. I wouldn't sort of think we've kind of cracked it in any ways, but those were 2 good ones. Having a vehicle that is almost different from both of your curriculums to work together on, and then having kind of a visual presence within the site itself seems kind of different here as well.
Yeah, and I'd say from the kind of faculty point of view, working with my head of geography, it's something that we've talked about a lot. But I suppose if we're going back to the challenges facing teachers in a world where you really want to make sure you get it right, and in a time poor world, it's difficult to really make it land in the way that we might want. It's something that I've talked about with the previous head of geography, the current head of geography, and I think there is some really, really powerful ways it can be done, but what that looks like, I think, takes an enormous amount of work and thought, and I think that we are still very much at the discussing what that might look like stage, I would say, but lots of will, but translating into reality is the challenge, I would say.
I think it is really hard to be honest about how challenging it is, but how important it is. I mean, that's what's brilliant. There are, so many people here today. I'm going to go back to Alison, because obviously you're trying to smooth some of that path and say we're offering CPD and we're offering kind of units that we've tried. And I think just to hear a bit about that experience, and maybe possibly some of the, you might want to say some more about some of the, the other units that you're doing or that you've done, but also what's coming back from the teachers who have tried the materials that you've been developing. What has their experience been?
Well, very, very positive, which is very nice. But early days to get a sense of impact, I think. We don't have, there's lots of teachers who've done our modules and then come back and said, yeah, we've implemented, because they've only been available for a few months. So if any of you out there want to engage with them and get in touch with us, we'd be delighted to have your input. The view we took with the design of the modules was that we would start with an introductory module, which is really it's kind of entry level. In other words, if this is something you haven't thought of very much before, then here are some ideas. And we take quite an expansive perspective, really, of what teaching in an age of climate and environmental crisis, teaching history in that time might look like. So it's not just about climate change, it's very much about the natural world, biodiversity loss, but also thinking about our relationship with the natural world through time. So how have people thought about the natural world in the medieval period, or how far did that change in the era of globalization, colonization? And Michael, rather brilliantly in the introductory module, does that through art. So what can art tell us about the way we've connected with the natural world? And I think that's a nice way in. It's not, if you're worried about being too political, it's not a political way in. And it's the kind of way in that does fit quite nicely in terms of, building up contextual knowledge of a period. So it can be part of that. How did people think back then, and how did they think about their environment? So, and we have some practical examples in the introductory module of teachers who are doing the kind of wrestling that Tom and David have described, including Peter Langdon, who's got an article in the most recent edition of Teaching History, who as a PGCE student designed an inquiry that was very brave, really, and has taught it to year 7, and it was okay. It went okay, but he's now decided it's better to teach it to year 9 because he thinks they're going to cope with it better. And so you can get that sense we've interviewed him in the module, and he shared all his resources, which is very kind of him. And you get this sense of, he hasn't got all the answers, but he's had a go, and this is what he was trying to achieve. So that's really, it is a kind of starting point, that first module. What we're now doing is trying to exemplify some of the principles that we identified in that first module within specific topics. And the one that's available at the moment for secondary history is looking at the Industrial Revolution, which most people teach, although I am discovering that some teachers manage to avoid it altogether. It's a reasonably, you would think, straightforward topic to connect to the climate crisis. But what does that look like in a meaningful way? And actually, the approach that we suggest in the module, and that we've tried out in the classroom with a colleague in North London, is how can we really home in on fossil fuels? Given that fossil fuels are without doubt the single biggest cause of the climate crisis, given that it was the Industrial Revolution really that kick-started our intensive use of fossil fuels, why on earth aren't we connecting that more explicitly to the mess we're in now? And the fact that we often, and I was the same, teach the Industrial Revolution and kind of run out of steam, no pun intended, by about 1870-ish, doesn't make much sense, given that actually our use of coal still by 1900 compared to today was relatively small scale. And we didn't have the internal combustion engine, or certainly not in any great number. We didn't have widespread use of oil. We didn't have widespread use of electricity. So we stop just when it's getting really important in terms of what's happening today. So that's an exemplification of what it might look like to take a topic that we already teach and to just change the emphasis a little bit. And one thing that might be worth sharing is that when my colleague trialed this in North London with year 9 girls, she was really unsure what they would think about a series of lessons focusing on fossil fuels and energy in the context of industrialization. It doesn't sound like the kind of thing 13 and 14-year-old girls are really going to go for. She said she was staggered. Absolutely. I mean, I was staggered in what she was telling me by how invested they were in it, because of course they're talking about these issues elsewhere in the curriculum. They hear about them on social media. They hear about them at home. So it's not like you know, we should steer clear of it in history because otherwise they might get really anxious about it. Actually, they want opportunities to find out more and learn more and understand what's happening and put it into context. So they were super invested in it. But what she did say, and this comes back to the cross-curricular dimension, she said afterwards, I was really lucky that they'd done stuff about fossil fuels and climate change in science already. Because if they hadn't, that would have been a tough one. And she said, no question, I would definitely check with the science department next time I teach that. And that's an example of a cross-curricular kind of collaboration, which is just a conversation, actually, with your head of science to check that, you know, and also how you're going to teach about different forms of energy so that you don't contradict the way that they do it in science. But it, you know, that was really positive. Last thing, also on the cross-curricularity or interdisciplinarity, our next module is going to be a joint history geography one for Key Stage 3. We're very excited about that, and that's going to be called Living Cities. So it's looking at sustainable cities, really, past and present and future. And the more we read about that, there's some fantastic, it's a wonderful book called Urban Jungle by Ben Wilson. I really recommend it. If you don't think sustainable cities, you know, history doesn't have much to say, wow, it has loads to say. And it's made Michael and I realize how badly history teachers and geography teachers teach about cities. Geography colleagues agree. So that's a joint, it's going to be a joint module and a joint kind of inquiry that can be delivered in a number of different ways. It can be delivered by one teacher, it can be delivered by you know, a history and geography teacher in parallel. Lots of different ways it can be done, but it's a conversation between history and geography, and that's where its power is going to lie. So that will be available at the end of this academic year.
It's really interesting to hear about the kind of diverse approaches, and I think a focus on cities, you know, given that so many of our peoples are in cities, and actually, but cities past, present, and future just, you know, offers so much. Having talked about a kind of cross curricular or interdisciplinary, and this notion that it is so important in young people's lives, and well, you know, everybody's lives. I am aware that, and you know, I was the parent of a very, very anxious child, who, you know, that risk of young people feeling, can we ever escape from it? And this sense of, if it's being picked up across the curriculum, and it's even happening in history, and history used to be an escape for me, and even if I'm doing nice stuff, it's about a world that no longer exists. So it is a kind of, you know, potentially quite oppressive topic. So I'm going to start with Tom, because he's nodding away going, oh yeah. So how is that being managed? How have people's reacted, and kind of, if you like, where is the hope, or how do we offer that? So a question, and I'll come back to Amanda with it in a moment about how undergraduates are feeling about that as well.
Yeah, it's a really, really valid point. And I mean, we've addressed it, I mean, actually through whole staff training as well. So actually raising it with staff, so staff are aware. So then in any of the delivery, there's not a casualness about it, and understanding this is very real for young people. I was really struck when you were talking earlier, Amanda, about that you mentioned the frightening of the horses, and I was thinking of exactly this point, and then also actually the historical point of the size of it as well, and that became potentially overwhelming as two things, as a potentially really worrying combination. And I think in terms of getting around that, it needs to be really skillful deployment of it, like in the same way that we've all been taught to teach the most sensitive issues by thinking really deeply about them, engaging with the scholarship about them, in the same way we teach the Holocaust. I mean, I would approach it with a similar level of caution, that that's very real for young people. Giving them a sense of agency in that is often a way that's then freed them from some of that anxiety. And I would probably come back a little bit to the stuff you can do around your own school and projects they can get actively involved in. I'm hopeful and thoughtful. For example, we do GCSE citizenship for every single student, and this could therefore be a launching point for a further investigation in their project there. We also do EPQ at year 12, and allowing them somewhere to take it, rather than it kind of ends with a sense of powerlessness and miserable. Okay, where do you go with it? Where can you take it? And the local connections, of course, the other way we would be able to do that. So here are other things you can get involved in as well that are kind of tangible action. David and I, again, it's very embryonic, but we'd really like to engage some of the student leaders in the school. So some of the year 12s who are already really passionate and fired up about these issues as co-curricular creators. So there'll be a really powerful voice in saying, well, what would you have wanted to be taught when you're in year 8 and year 9? And is that too much? And is that laying it on a bit thick? I feel they would give us some pretty convincing answers there as well. David, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, they're all great points there. And I probably also would say, if I go back to that conversation with the year 9 that says to me, I don't want to take GCSE history, I want to take geography. I think there is also, if looking at a wider curriculum, history does offer stories of social movements and hope. I mean, we look at abolition, women's suffrage, etc. Like, that's something I think that history can offer in a way that might not be directly about environmental history in a substantive sense, but there are also kind of messages there, I think, that can be really powerful and important for young people.
Sorry, can I come back to Amanda and just sort of pick up on the sort of student reaction and the student experience, whether again, you know, undergraduates are kind of made anxious or worried by it, or, you know, in a similar way, are they engaging and have a current focus, or, you know, what's been the sort of view coming from them?
It's sort of quite hard to generalize. I feel as if we're not the ones who are going to make them anxious. It's just a bad situation, and if they've got any understanding of it at all, they'll be already frightened to varying degrees, or try not to think about it. I mean, I'm kind of also impressed by the capacity to bury their heads in the sand, which is of course shared right across society, and it's probably the greatest danger of all. So I think that there's quite a spectrum of responses. I'm sure everyone will feel that already with a classroom. You get the fiercely engaged students right through to the ones who just don't want to know about any subject. I mean, I tend to, I guess I've been on a bit of a trajectory with this myself, and I have children who, you know, at what point do you actually get to break it to them? You wait till they're teenagers and hit them with that as well, or, you know, and of course it's not really in our hands, but I mean, there's a sort of ethics to it, and I kind of feel as educators, if we're not giving them the space to talk about it, who is? And, you know, all the stuff I don't even need to go through, like, you know, they're getting their information from social media, or they don't have adults who they can talk about it with. You know, a lot of parents are maybe not very equipped to have the conversations, don't want to have the conversations. This is almost talking about it creates a kind of safe space. And there is quite a lot of research, I think, that suggests that grappling with it is much better for mental health than hiding from it. And I suppose probably most of us have been through a personal trajectory of being scared by the headlines and eventually thinking, okay, I'll just do something about this, and then at least I, you know, maybe it takes people in different ways. So I mean, I think that, I mean, environmental history could probably equip people in a less direct way, rather than saying, okay, we're having climate change, let's talk about environmental history. I mean, to understand anything, you can bring the environment in, and then some of this is a little bit less shocking. But I think if one does want to kind of grapple with climate crisis in the history classroom, that's, if you're talking to scientists about it, they have really alarming looking charts, you know, temperatures going up, and tipping points and all these things that are, I mean, if you're talking to a scientist about it properly, it's not particularly determinist, because there are all sorts of possibilities. You know, if we do this, this thing will happen. But the way it's kind of mapped out for public consumption, I suspect the way it's often broached in schools is, look at this chart, things, you know, emissions going up and temperatures going up. But what we can do is actually unpick that determinism. And I think that that's quite a valuable thing. It's in the history classroom where you can say the stuff that I was sort of alluding to earlier, you know, that these things happen. I mean, yes, there's a temperature, but what are you going to do in that temperature? Are you sharing the water? Are you, I don't know, are you rounding up a lot of people and kind of getting rid of them so you don't have to feed them? You know, what are you doing about food shortages? And there's a host of different responses, but I kind of think maybe not quite yet, but I mean, there already are food shortages, and they'll get worse. And these kids may not even have left school by the time these are real issues that they've got to face in this country. So I kind of feel that the best thing we can do is to kind of start talking about it, give them the tools to talk about it without necessarily bringing the kind of hard, scary things in. I mean, I would probably not want to talk about food shortages, even undergraduates who are older, in that particular way that I have just now. But But if you talk about how's food distributed, what sorts of, what social inequality, how do you think about different ethnic groups within a society? Do you think everyone equally deserves, the Holocaust is actually quite a useful example for thinking about how to deal with climate change. Do you see what I mean? Like there's sort of all sorts of ways of getting at it, depending on how you feel the class is going. I mean, I don't know how possible it is in a school classroom to change tack if you feel that things aren't quite working. But there's certainly on the level of sensitivities that you can probably do that. Sorry, I don't know if I'm waffling. It's something I think about quite a lot. I
think you're definitely not waffling. I mean, there are huge questions, and just to add to that complexity, there's a question coming through the Q&A, and you've begun to touch on, Amanda, which is the whole climate justice issue, and I mean, I think everybody could probably come in here, and it may may connect back to what Tom's been saying about Holocaust education. I know, Alison, that the UCL sort of initiative has had a group that's been particularly looking at the relationship between colonialism and climate destruction, really, total devastation, and those issues. So I don't know who'd like to go first, whether Amanda would like to carry on, or I'll sort of open it up to anybody who'd like to respond to. I mean, maybe we'll start the school perspective. Has that sort of the climate justice question? So again, it might link to what Tom was saying, maybe about citizenship, but again, how far those issues are coming into the teaching that you're doing.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. It almost goes then wider in the role of schools, and it will be different to universities, about the duty of impartiality. It's interesting that the guidance on that has specific sections on climate change, and it does make for an interesting read, and it makes for a difficult position for campaigning within schools, and what you should be allowing and not allowing students to do, stroke telling them, not telling them to do. Especially when you combine that with my earlier point about agency, because they really value the agency, and I feel like they really need the agency. Otherwise, they do become powerless within it. But it does have its risk to cause further anxiety if you're having kind of huge climate justice events within school. That's not necessarily healthy for other students, and so being wary of that. The tightness of things like the citizenship projects and the EPQ actually gives a more academic structure. So we've certainly found them pretty useful as well. That it hems them in, it allows us to see the work, it allows us also to see the information sources, which again has already been raised, but it's such an important point. Where is the information they're getting coming from? I guess the other thing that jumps out in my mind on this is something we've actually been thinking about through the current Gaza crisis and the Palestinian crisis, is how you walk with them on it. It's been a phrase that's been ringing through in my head a lot, is they're thinking about this. You can't just leave them to it. In the same way, you can't have huge kind of campaigns, protests necessarily going on in schools, but you need to walk with them. You need to be with them, which is a lot about creating spaces to listen and building knowledge and confidence among the students, but also among the staff, to have really good conversations. So if a student did approach us about really, really strong feelings about climate justice, we'd want to be skilled enough to create a space for them to talk about it, but not necessarily mean, right, oh crikey, we better do a massive assembly and get them up in front of the whole school, which may actually create further anxiety for other students. So I think that's probably where I'd be at on that issue.
That is a beautiful phrase, Tom. I just think that's so helpful. I will take that away, and I think the power of can we put some structure in. So I think that the understanding and helping students to think and to listen, that's just incredibly powerful, combined with how do we support that kind of care. And I think that the need to walk really carefully. I mean, I was in the current issue of Teaching History, which I will waive at this point, just because it's freely available at the moment. So it's another of the links that we'll share, and it's lots of examples of teachers at different stages, but many of them at a very early point. But I wanted to put in there a case study just in the student teacher, the move me on problem, and talking about you know, the early difficulties of someone who's wanting to move forward. And I was terrified even of saying that a teacher had been inspired by Extinction Rebellion, because that now has, you know, the label of an extremist group as far as the government's concerned. And I felt I needed to run it by the CEO and say, are you worried if we say a teacher, they're not necessarily doing anything about, you know, holding protests themselves or get anything like that? I just want to say that was you know, that was what got them thinking, and they have become involved. And so that level of care about how we work and are seen to be working by, you know, whether it's by parents who are worried or, you know, that sort of political space. Alison, did you want to come in from the perspective of the centre, how you're looking or thinking about that, or any more of the examples of the sort of links between, you know, colonial history and possibly climate?
Well, I mean, it's a huge part of Amitav Ghosh's work, Nutmeg's Curse, and that's something that we tackle in the first module. I feel quite embarrassed actually by the way I used to teach about colonialism on so many levels actually, but the fact that I never used to think about an environmental perspective and its ongoing you know, kind of inequalities in that regard. It ties in with the Industrial Revolution stuff as well, actually. So, you know, why have fossil fuels been consumed in such vast quantities in certain parts of the world and not others? And it's, you know, it's just a hugely regrettable and ironic fact that those parts of the world that haven't been consuming fossil fuels are the ones that are going to suffer disproportionately. And you know, young people certainly need to understand that. But can I just come back to the hope point from earlier, because we have thought about this a lot in the centre. I always talk about getting that balance between honesty and hope right. There is a new phenomenon called the new climate denial. It's being described as it's very pervasive in social media. So a kind of outright denial that climate change is happening is declining, but it's being replaced by this new climate denial, which is effectively particularly social media influencers saying that it's exaggerated, that climate change might be happening, but it's vastly exaggerated. It's going to take a really long time for it to have any impact, and the kinds of solutions that are being proposed are the wrong ones. I think that's super dangerous, and that's the sort of stuff that some young people are going to be exposed to, and I think that's really worth bearing in mind. But what I wanted to say in terms of hope, I think we're quite well placed in history actually to not blind hope, which is a form of denial in its own way, but a realistic source of hope, because there are so many different paths that could have been taken in the past. Just as, you know, the past wasn't determined, neither is the future. I'm sure I've actually got this original point from Amanda and the fantastic conversations we've had. And you know, one example in our module on the Industrial Revolution is the shift to coal-powered steam was not inevitable. And actually water power was doing just fine, thank you very much. If you read the work of Andreas Malm, that kind of gives you a sort of different take on that. So that could have been a different kind of path. So there are different paths now, and history kind of shows us that. I think also we can see the pace of change. I think that providing kids with this perspective that intensive use of fossil fuels represents a really tiny proportion of our time on Earth is quite helpful, because, you know, the generation that has benefited most from intensive fossil fuel use, you know, some of them are, lots of them are still alive. You know, it's a lifetime. That's not a huge in human terms amount of time. So I think that's a cause of some hope. And the last thing, I think it's really important we also find joy where we can. This has become a bit of a watchword for us in the centre, but, you know, is there ways in which we can find joy? And the sort of work that Kim does in White and Woods and so on, just wonderful stuff around nature connection. I think we can do a bit of that in history as well. Michael's work for primary history teachers around woodland and trees is a really good example of this. And getting kids to understand what the very first tree to arrive after the last ice age. Anyone know what the very first tree was to arrive in Britain after the last ice age? No, you see this, we should know these things, shouldn't we? I didn't know, and it's the birch tree. And we did some stuff with primary school kids around, they were miming the arrival of the first trees, the Scots pine, the hazel, the birch. And then we took them out into some woodland, and they were noticing the trees in a very excited way because they knew something about the importance of these trees in British landscapes over, thousands of years. So we shouldn't lose sight of the joy as well as the seriousness.
Brilliant. I am aware we've got a sort of just over 15 minutes left, and I've got sort of one question which I'm going to ask definitely out to the people who are here. But I am aware we've responded to one question that's come in. David wants to talk about joy. We'll let David talk about joy. Then if there are other questions people wanted to ask, otherwise I'm going to ask it's sort of everybody in the room a question. But just want to make sure we do have time for questions. But David, talk more about joy. That would be fabulous.
Just very quickly, I just wanted to say how much I agreed with that. And just to connect this with another kind of real part of the discourse of history teaching, one of the really exciting conversations that the history community have been having over the last few years is about world building. And it's about that kind of really intentional cultivating of rich cognitive pictures. And that feels to me like an incredibly fertile area to really joyfully bring the kind of the environmental aspects to life. Like I don't think my classroom is ever kind of more focused and joyful than when I'm reading bits of Ian Mortimer's Time Traveller's Guide. There's this lovely bit where he talks about how quiet the medieval countryside is and about how the noises people heard in their lives and how a plane is far louder than anything they would ever have heard. But what did they hear? What did their environment sound like? And that really is joyful, really is wonderful, and really it does land really richly in the classroom. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. I'm so glad. And Amanda wants to say something about joy too.
Just a super quick observation, a bit building on what Alison said, but I think another kind of well-known strategy that's being deployed at the moment in terms of climate denial is inducing hopelessness. So people just think, well, there's nothing I can do, so I'm going to check out. And I think that that's a place where, it's a slightly more doer starting point, but it kind of ends up with the same sort of thing. And in a sense, one can think of these opportunities, these situations in the past as opportunities for building a society that we're happier with, and leading. And I mean, I think that it could even tie in with employment. Do you want to go into a sustainable profession? Kind of green plumbing, or there's a whole. I've heard some quite interesting conversations about even vocational degrees that look or training that just sort of looks a bit different because of the environmental change. And I think all these are areas that can connect across the school in different ways to offer hope.
Absolutely. Okay, we've had two more questions come in. I'm going to pick up the first one, which came next from Hugo about exam boards, and that was really going to be my question out to people here, who are attending. But I mean, Hugo's absolutely right that the exam boards have a phenomenal influence on what happens in schools, but they are also influenceable. Is that right? You can anyway. Certainly what's been happening with decolonizing curricula, it has been really interesting to sit in meetings with exam boards, kind of being forced to listen to teachers who have been saying to them, "This is what we've been doing with our curricula at Key Stage 3. How are you responding?" And there really is a willingness, and certainly, as we sit here wondering if we're going to have a new government and what happens with exam boards if the administration changes, and if it doesn't, we still need new specs because they can't go on forever. So I'd be interested to know whether Alison, there's been any conversation that you've had with exam boards to, from the centre point of view. Equally, whether, I mean, we know exam boards are sort of talking to academics about, the kind of, influenced by the Black Lives Matter movement, and that diversifying, if not decolonising, but at least diversifying, whether that has begun at all with exam boards, thinking about this and beginning to engage with academics. But otherwise, my question to the participants here, and you might like to share things, what would you like to see in new specs when they come out? But I'll start with Alison and Amanda, and then if people have got comments they want to make in the chat about what they'd like to see in the new specs, that would be really interesting to hear.
Yeah, I'm really glad Hugo asked that question. I think it's a really important question, and we've not had extensive conversations with awarding bodies, except one awarding body did approach me and Michael to talk about the possibility of a development study around environmental history at GCSE. Interestingly, they are seeing it as a way of boosting numbers, taking that option, because they thought it would be a popular one, which is a really great conversation to have had. I hope that's going to go forward. That's kind of the limit of it so far.
Amanda, do you have any sense of exam boards beginning to ask questions or engage with what's going on in higher education?
Not in this country at the moment that I'm aware of. Doesn't mean it's not happening, but
yeah.
I mean, I think some of it's producing the textbooks and the. I mean, obviously that has to happen in a conversation. I think it's the materials are beginning to appear, but there's just been a boom in the last 10 years, and of course that takes a bit of time to translate.
Yeah. I mean, I think there is generally, and I think what's happened with the diversity agenda. It's not necessarily a decolonizing agenda, but certainly the diversity agenda. The publishers and also in their interaction with the exam boards, there is an awareness and an interest to listen that wasn't there the last time the specs changed. So I think the scope for pressure from below to move things on, and that awareness of the exam boards that they need to be engaging with historians means that I think there may there will be scope, but it's also worth getting your case together. So to be lobbying, but the exam boards do more consulting. So we've got kind of encouragement to share more. I think most of the other comments in the chat have been where you can get all the resources. So we've had the links to UCL, and we've had the teaching history. Panelists, any other things you would say about what you'd like to see in the other things you'd like to see in the specs that would make your task easier, because then you have to do it?
I mean, a development study makes so much sense, and it was just great to hear that conversation's happening. That'd be really, really exciting. And just to reiterate what you were saying, it does play such a big role in the curricular choices and that schools make. And if that, it would be transformative, I think, if that was to become something that was really kind of widely taught at GCSE.
Tom, you've talked about the natural history course, and I think that is worth just kind of pausing for a moment, and again that might have influences elsewhere. I think I was really worried when that was kind of announced, that it would be another glorious thing that the independent sector could do, but mainstream comprehensive schools were shut out of. So it's really interesting to know that as a big secondary school, you're thinking about taking, you are, I think, sound absolutely committed to taking that on, and how easy has that been to do? Just tell us a bit about that decision making behind that.
Yeah, we do feel like we'd like to give it a try. Where we see it will sit initially, though, is actually as an enrichment activity, potentially targeting year 12. Essentially, I mean, and he's talking about how easy is it with the materials. There really aren't any materials available. And they don't seem to be coming particularly quickly. So what we feel is the best thing to do is to try it first with year 12s. And possibly to try and run it slightly quicker. They may do the exam, but we also may self-certify throughout, just to sort of draw the interest and sort of say, you've done these parts of this course, so that they've got something to work towards. So that's our initial one. We currently have a kind of similar thing with astronomy, where we run an astronomy course after school. So it will be voluntary, it will be in addition, which will have its own problems, but we're hoping that enables us to build the expertise to be able to teach it effectively and then see where we go next. I mean, one thing we have done is we have appointed someone with a TLR to do it. And again, if good question I think to ask of your SLTs is, okay, well, if all this work is going to happen at some point, who's going to do it and who's going to get paid to do it, I think is a good question. And that could relate to the history curriculum as well. If you're talking about significant, extra difficult work, I think that's a really good question to ask of your SLT. We've got 2 TLRs related to this issue. And so this is one that it connects with the ecology work as well, that teacher is going to really champion it and hopefully therefore facilitate some of the cross-curricular stuff. Because unsurprisingly, she's a scientist, she's amazing, and an extensive experience, but I think she's going to want to draw on some of the other expertise in the school to help kind of move that on. I mean, we're fortunate, we've been lucky with the connections with the university and some of the access and drive we've got there. It's been really helpful in terms of giving the confidence. But yeah, that's the approach we're going to take and then really see where we are. I struggle to see how it will sit in a GCSE option, which is the interesting point. And we're lucky enough to still offer 4. Most schools probably offer 3. And if you're offering almost like essentially another science, that's a lot of science that the kids are doing. And I do worry about the place of history and the arts within that if it becomes a mainstream offer. So I'm cautious there as to where it will fit in our genuine options offer. But we would like to give it a try because we think the interest is there.
That's really helpful to sort of explore that. I'm aware I've overlooked Tim Davis's kind of question about on joy. So going back to the on joy, but it's a plug for Kate Raworth on Kate Raworth's donut economics. But what is it that makes this place thrive, which I think is it's a really good recommendation, and again a lovely way of picking up on the positives, and again historical examples that could also have a future dimension about how can we make this place thrive. Again, so sorry for having overlooked that earlier. What we've begun to do, we've now got about 8 minutes left officially, and it's been gathering in the chat are suggestions about where to go next. So I'd like to sort of give the last few minutes over to that about sort of network building or connections. I know Alison's already put out a plea to anyone who's interested in trialing work that UCL, the modules that are being developed there through the UCL unit. So I'm going to go to Alison and perhaps say a little bit more about that. But just while I think about it, just thinking about the sort of stimulus that's coming from above. So the sort of DFE sustainability strategy, which we haven't kind of talked about at all, whether it just be worth mentioning that in closing. But then I think I'll just go around and sort of what more can we do? People are interested, where else to go next? Have we talked about all the options? And again, people who are listening may also have things they want to contribute about networks or where to go next. But Alison.
So the DFE climate change sustainability strategy was released nearly 2 years ago, it was brilliant to have it because we've never had anything like that coming out of DFE before. There are 5 strands, and it kind of demonstrates the holistic nature of this whole area for schools, because it encompasses what schools are doing around their own estates. So how, their buildings and their school grounds, their procurement. How they can procure most sustainably, green skills and careers. And then there is a strand which is climate education. And there's some really interesting initiatives like the National Education Nature Park with the Natural History Museum. And there's going to be a Climate Leaders Award and the GCSE Natural History. It was a shame that the strategy didn't go further in seeing this as a whole curriculum issue. And there are organisations, including a student-led organisation called Teach the Future, which some of you may have heard of, that have got the Labour Party to promise that they will adopt the Climate Education Bill, which the #1 clause of that bill will be, let's embed this across the whole curriculum. And the strategy didn't really go far enough. In fact, the strategy even alienated some geography teachers because it was so science oriented. So that was a bit of a shame, but there is some movement, and it's good to have the strategy. From a very practical point of view, in theory, all schools should have a sustainability lead by 2025 and a climate action plan by 2025. But there's no way of enforcing that at the moment, and there's no extra money for it. So nobody really knows how many schools so far have one, but Charwell obviously has maybe 2 by the sounds of it. So that's a very good thing. The where next, just to come back to my offer, and it's a genuine offer, we would really like to have lots of modules that showcase the sorts of really interesting practice that's going on in schools. And we think a really good model for us going forward is actually to develop these modules with a department or two departments. And so really very, very happy for you to, I'll put my email in the chat, very happy for you to contact me if you're doing interesting things. And I'm hoping with the Historical Association and hopefully as well with Catherine and from people at UCL, we're going to keep going with, well, we're going to launch a teacher network, an HA sponsored teacher network, which will be an informal way for you to just, hopefully we could link in with this group in some way and not duplicate, but just a forum where people can come together and share what they're doing would be really good.
Anything else from anybody else? I've got one more plug. It's not really a network thing, but I couldn't bear to end this without mentioning Kate Hawkey, who has been a sort of pioneer of thinking about the history of the environment and what is history teaching's contribution to it. And I'll hope that Jo can quickly find her book, or maybe Alison can, so we add that to the links, because her book is published freely through UCL Press, so you can download it. I think it's such a great book. I would want a physical copy of it as well. But Kate Hawkey, an area we haven't had time to discuss, but it's that worry, and certainly when Tom said, oh, I wince when we talk about cross curricular, because actually subject disciplinary understandings are so important. And Kate has really done a lot of that thinking about how does this relate to our discipline as well as to practical examples. So if you've not come across her book, Alison, can you remind me the title? I'm feeling shocking that can't even. You're on mute at the moment.
Sorry. It's called History in the Climate Crisis, Environmental History in the Classroom.
Brilliant, thank you. Which kind of sums it up. But I think anyone interested in reading and thinking further, Kate's book is brilliant, and the fact that you can get it from brilliant. David's got it into the chat. Thank you. That's available through UCL Press.
Catherine, can I just sorry I'm just going to put a final link in the chat. I won't put any more in, but there is also an organisation called Teach Climate History, and we meet 6 times a year just for an hour. It's the end of a school day, and we just invite interesting people to come and talk to us. Amanda came and talked to us in the early days when we just set up. We've had historians, we get other teachers to come and share. It's just a really nice group, a talk for about 40 minutes and then a bit of questions. So please do have a look at what's coming up.
Brilliant. And I'll do a final plug for teaching history. We've said it's free, even if you're not an HA, a Historical Association member at the moment. It's free for another few days, but it's a wonderful wealth of examples of people like Peter, who began as a PGCE student saying, I'm going to work on this, and he's been able to think through his inquiry. There are small examples of teachers who've been inspired by Kate Hawkey and at really different stages of development and doing very different things. And for some schools, they said it's just on the agenda at our department meetings, and all we're doing at the moment is talking about it. We're not actually trying anything yet, but we're building up that confidence that Tom and David spoke about. To more developed examples, people who've trialed some of the units that Alison's talked about, or have used Amitav Ghosh's work. So there's a great range of things, and quite a challenging set of principles Helen Snelson's written about, in thinking about if we're running trips. So that taking the what is our commitment to sustainability, and are you going to commit to doing trips by public transport? Or actually, I was out on the Cowley Road in Oxford yesterday working with our PGC students about, you don't have to go to a castle, you can actually come here on the bus, and what are we doing in the way that we work to take sustainability issues seriously? So there's a whole diverse range of things there. Thank you so much to all the panelists. I feel hugely privileged. There's one more question. So it says, thank you for a wonderful session. Is there a question? I'm from India and have been thinking of implementing something on the lines of climate education in government schools. I would like to collaborate and brainstorm. Okay, we will try and follow up that link. And I think actually international collaboration, and that's something that's also gone on through the sort of informal groups that have been stimulated by UCL. And it's an area we haven't talked about, but I think there's a huge question about how there's huge potential. I mean, that is the great thing about online connections and working internationally in collaboration, and it allows us to pick up the climate justice issue as well. So thank you for that final question. And I think that's something, the Deanery, which is trying to expand its remit, can also promote. But I will stop there. Hamish has come in to go, stop now, we've reached the 5:15. But I found this hugely valuable. I hope participants have. And thank you to all the panelists.
That's fabulous. Thank you so much, Catherine, and thank you very much to the panel. It just leaves me to thank you all for attending today. I hope that you found that the session today has been valuable. I certainly have been fascinated. It's not my field, but of course, sustainability and climate is everybody's field. I want to just remind everybody about the Deanery, that we do convene events on all sorts of topics. Joe is going to put into the chat some links to take you to our website so you can see what's coming next. Just to give you some examples, we have a half-day in-person session on language development in the early years and a full-day session on English as an additional language coming up later on this academic year. We also have what we call Deanery Digests, which are plain language summaries of the research of our researchers in the department on our website, designed for teachers with teachers in mind and policymakers, so that we can try to translate some of our research into language which is easily understandable by everybody. So please do take a look at those. We'd also be very grateful if you could complete the feedback form for this session to tell us what you thought about it. We want to continually improve and provide things that are going to be nourishing to your intellectual curiosity and so on. So some feedback from that in that respect would be great. We will also compile everything that we've talked about today, including a recording of this session, but all of the links that have been shared and other information about this, and we'll email those to you after the end of the session. So again, thank you very much for your attendance. I'd like to thank the sustainability group under the auspices of the Oxford Education Deanery, Travis, Megan, Phoebe and Kim, for convening this and making this event happen, and particularly to our panelists today, Catherine Byrne, David Hibbert, Tom Hilton, Alison Kitson and Amanda Power. Thank you all for your contributions. It's been fascinating, and I should leave everybody to get on with their evening. Have a lovely end of the week.